Let us now seriously consider the main cases in which a rise of wages is attempted or a reduction of wages is resisted. We have seen that the value of laboring power, or in more popular parlance, the value of labor, is determined by the value of necessaries, or the quantity of labor required to produce them. If then, in a given country, the value of the daily average necessaries of the laborer represented 6 hours of labor, expressed in 3 shillings, the laborer would have to work 6 hours daily to produce an equivalent for this daily maintenance. If the whole working day was 12 hours, the capitalist would pay him the value of his labor by paying him 3 shillings. Half the working day would be unpaid labor. The rate of profit would amount to 100%. But now, suppose that consequent upon a decrease in productivity, more labor should be wanted to produce the same amount of agricultural produce, so that the price of the average daily necessaries should rise from 3 to 4 shillings. In that case, the value of labor would rise by 1/3, or 33.33%. 8 hours of the working day would be required to produce an equivalent for the daily maintenance of the laborer, according to this old standard of living. The surplus labor would therefore sink from 6 hours to 4, and the rate of profit from 100% to 50%. But insisting upon a rise of wages, the laborer would only insist on getting the increased value of his labor, like every other seller of a commodity, who, the costs of his commodities having increased, tries to get its increased value paid. If the wages did not rise, or not sufficiently to rise to compensate for the increased values of necessaries, the price of labor would sink below the value of labor, and the laborer's standard of life would deteriorate. But a change might also take place in the opposite direction. By virtue of the increased productivity of labor, the same amount of the average daily necessaries might sink from 3 to 2 shillings. Only 4 hours out of the working day instead of 6 be wanted to reproduce the equivalent value for the value of the daily necessaries. The working man would now be able to buy with 2 shillings as many necessaries as he did before with 3 shillings. Indeed, the value of labor would have sunk, but diminished value would command the same amount of commodities as before. Then profits would rise from 3 to 4 shillings, and the rate of profit from 100 to 200%. Although the laborer's absolute standard of life would have remained the same, his relative wages, and therewith his relative social position as compared to that of the capitalist, would have been lowered. If the working man should resist that reduction of relative wages, he would only try to get some of the share of the increased productive powers of his own labor, and to maintain his former relative position in the social scale. Thus, after the abolition of the Corn Laws and the flagrant violation of the most solemn pledges given during the anti-Corn Law agitation, the English factory lords generally reduced wages by 10%. The resistance of the workmen was at first baffled, but consequent upon circumstances I cannot enter into now, the 10% lost were afterwards regained. The values of necessaries, and consequently the value of labor, might remain the same, but a change might occur in their money prices consequent upon a previous change in the value of money. By the discovery of more fertile mines and so forth, 2 ounces of gold might, for example, cost no more labor to produce than 1 ounce did before. The value of gold would then be depreciated by 1/2, or 50%. As the values of all other commodities would then be expressed in twice their former money prices, so the same with the value of labor. 12 hours of labor, formerly expressed in 6 shillings, would now be expressed in 12 shillings. If the working man's wages should remain 3 shillings instead of rising to 6 shillings, the money price of his labor would only be equal to half the value of his labor, and his standard of life would fearfully deteriorate. This would also happen in a greater or lesser degrees if his wages should rise, but not proportionately to the fall in the value of gold. In such a case, nothing would have been changed, either the productive powers of labor or the supply and demand, or in values. Nothing would have changed except the money names of those values. To say that in such a case the workman ought not to insist on a proportionate rise of wages is to say that he must be content to be paid with names instead of with things. All past history proves that whenever such a depreciation of money occurs, the capitalists are on alert to seize the opportunity for defrauding the workmen. A very large school of political economists assert that, consequent upon the new discoveries of gold lands, the better working of silver mines, and the cheaper supply of quicksilver, the value of precious metals has again depreciated. This would explain the general and simultaneous attempts on the continent for a rise of wages. We have until now supposed that the working day has given limits. The working day, however, has by itself no constant limits. It is the constant tendency of capital to stretch it to its utmost physically possible length, because the same degree of surplus labor, and consequently the profit resulting therefrom, will be increased. The more capital succeeds in prolonging the working day, the greater amount of other people's labor it will appropriate. During the 17th and even the first 2/3 of the 18th century, a 10 hours working day was the normal working day all over England. During the anti-Jacobin War, which was in fact a war waged by the British barons against the British working masses, capital celebrated its bacchanalia, a prolonged working day from 10 to 12, 14, even 18 hours. Malthus, by no means a man whom you would suspect of maudlin sentimentalism, declared in a pamphlet published about 1815 that if this sort of thing was to go on, the life of the nation would be attacked at its very source. A few years before the general introduction of newly invented machinery, about 1765, a pamphlet appeared in England under the title An Essay on Trade. The anonymous author, an avowed enemy of the working classes, declaims on the necessity for expanding the limits of the working day. Amongst other means to this end, he proposes working houses, in which he says ought to be houses of terror. And what is the length of the working he prescribes for these houses of terror? 12 hours. The very same time which in 1832 was declared by capitalists, political economists, and ministers to be not only the existing but the necessary time of labor for a child under 12 years.